Those stories about intimate human-earth relations give us a sense of a different kind of nature awareness, where instead of a scientist studying an object, it's about people experiencing a world of gifts, experiencing themselves in intimate relationship with their land. So intimate that indigenous traditions often have multi-species kinship groups. Humans aren't seen as separate from the rest of the earth. The rest of the earth community is seen as our relatives, as kin. And so this kind of nature awareness is its own kind of contemplative work. It's different than mindfulness meditation, for instance, because in this case, you might be looking outward more than looking inward. But it's the same sense of grounding yourself in a peaceful, non-judgmental, and intimate relationship with the world around you. Feeling of interconnectedness, reciprocity, a recognition that our thinking isn't stuck inside of us like a ghost in a machine. Our thinking, our feeling is embodied, it's experiential, it's extended in our environment. In a way that when a bird flies overhead, you know what it means. It might mean that something is chasing that bird and you might want to run away too. Maybe it means a storm's coming. You learn to read the signs of the world around you. And some people would say, well, how am I supposed to learn these practices if I'm not indigenous? You can relearn nature awareness practices even if you're not an indigenous person. This is often referred to as bioregionalism. This idea that you can live in your bioregion, your place, your ecosystem in an intimate way. And it could begin with something as simple as learning your cardinal directions. Right now, do you know which direction north is? It's easy to get turned around in our cities and our urban or suburban lifestyles. But just remembering your place on the planet is a way to connect. So we could talk about indigenous traditions a lot more. We'll have time for questions a little bit toward the end. So happy to talk more about any of these. But there's so many traditions to get to, we have to move kind of quickly. We're talking about the whole living earth community. It's amazing, the effulgent diversity of different ways of understanding. So maybe let's move toward what are generally called Eastern religions, like Buddhism, Hinduism, ancient Chinese religions like Confucianism and Daoism. I guess maybe Buddhism is a good place to start because mindfulness meditation is often really deeply associated with what contemplation is all about. And you might be familiar with mindfulness-based stress reduction, developed by John Kabat-Zinn. So mindfulness has already been shown to help reduce symptoms of eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety, I believe this year is the first year that word has been entered into the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's an official term, and psychologists have been talking about it for a little while now. But it's a new form of anxiety caused by the collapse of ecosystems worldwide, right? Global climate change, mass extinction, droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, environmental conditions eroding causes a lot of anxiety in people, even if you don't know that's what's causing anxiety. And one way to help, mindfulness. But it's more than that, though. It doesn't just reduce anxiety. It also helps us understand the way our mind works. So much of what mindfulness meditation does is allows you to recognize how your desires are shaping your thoughts and shaping your actions. And desire is a big thing driving our consumer society. So mindfulness meditation actually takes your attention back from consumer society. Consumer society wants to capture your attention and wants to capitalize on it. Mindfulness brings that attention back to you, and you can turn your desires around so that they're not oriented toward consumption or whatever kind of selfish and greedy tendencies are so inimical to consumer society. Doesn't mean you get rid of desires. Turns out to be alive means you have desires. You can't delete those, but you can reorient them from this kind of selfish perspective or consumerist perspective towards something more compassionate. So not only does mindfulness help reduce stress, it helps you be more compassionate. And then compassion doesn't feel like work. Sometimes it just sounds like you're giving somebody extra homework when you tell them to be more compassionate. Like, another thing to do. I have enough to do in my life. Now I also have to be more compassionate to people. No, it turns out it feels good. The more that you do it, the more you want to do becomes contagious. The more that you practice compassion, the more other people feel like they want to as well. One of the things about this kind of contemplative approach to ecology that I can't stress enough is that it feels good. Too often, environmentalists have framed the work of environmental activism and advocacy in pretty negative terms. That it sounds like we all have to stop enjoying life, right? We have to stop eating the things we like. We have to stop driving, stop flying. All this is all about not doing different things. Which, all that could be true in a certain way. But it doesn't really motivate people to act when you're just telling them how hard it's going to be. Mindfulness actually shows us that it doesn't have to be hard. It can actually feel good. It can feel good. It can feel joyous. You can turn eco-anxiety into eco-joy. It doesn't mean it's always going to be happy. There's still tough times ahead. But you can have a deep sense of peace and joy in the livelihood that you have. So, reduce eco-anxiety, sure, but also learn to enjoy life, learn to enjoy your desires. Have a celebratory relationship with the earth community. After all, this connects back to the indigenous sense of the world as an ecology of gifts. Everything's a gift, nothing's just a resource. Everything's a source of life, not only a resource to be consumed. So let's live in this kind of celebration of gift giving. So there's a lot of other things to be said about Buddhist meditation as well. Mindfulness was just one point to kind of draw on. But geez, the world of Buddhist environmentalism extends really through all the different sects of Buddhism. So there's a lot to be said for the different ways that we can integrate Buddhist perspectives to help our contemplative practice. But it's more than just mindfulness. Every tradition has different ways of doing this kind of deep meditative encounter with the natural world. Hinduism is a good example. Hinduism, I think if you look at a lot of the literature in Hinduism and environmentalism, or you just talk to people about what they think about Hinduism, maybe they think about yoga first. That's a very common part of Hinduism. Or they might think about a kind of non-dual meditation, right? Meditating on the oneness or the non-duality of ourselves and our relationship to the universe. But when people do on-the-ground ethnographic work, right, anthropological work, let's go to India, let's study what actual Hindus are doing in their daily lives, there's another thing that shows up. It's not just yoga, it's not just meditating on non-duality, it's also devotion, bhakti, right? That's the old Sanskrit word for devotion, and very famously elaborated in the Bhagavad Gita, right, this classical Hindu text that says the best way to get to God, loving devotion. It doesn't always have to be yoga and meditation. It can come from the heart. It can be a kind of affectual insight, an emotional road to a contemplative encounter with the earth. You see this in a variety of places. In northern India, for instance, there's Mount Govardhan. And it's a mountain. And the people believe that this mountain is Lord Krishna. Krishna is an incarnation of the god Vishnu. The mountain is a god. People perceive it as a god. And what do they do to connect with that perception? Pilgrimage, right? They do this kind of ritual activity of being with the mountain, being on the mountain, regularly returning to that mountain to show the mountain love and devotion, service. You can also see this with some of the famous rivers in India, the Yamuna River, the Ganges River. Both of which are in legal struggles to gain the rights of personhood. If you think a river is a goddess and a mountain is a god, then you're probably also going to give rights to these beings. So again, not only does this kind of loving attention heal us in a psychological, spiritual way, it also has really serious ethical and legal implications. The more that we can open up to a contemplative perspective to Earth, the more we have legal grounds for defending it. If a river is just H2O, there might not be a lot of moral grounds or legal grounds for caring. But if a river means more than just a resource or a molecule, if it has some intrinsic value that you can connect to through love, through devotion, right, then you see it differently. So much of the question that we have to ask ourselves, what is Earth? it might be that some of us have some mistaken assumptions about that, especially our current economic system that treats Earth like a big pile of resources, like a collection of objects. For Thomas Berry, articulating this need for a great work of our time, he says the universe is not a collection of objects. It's quite the opposite. It's a communion of subjects, persons, gods and goddesses. Nothing is just a passive object. Everything has some kind of subjectivity or agency or capacity to act. We're in a lively world. There's no dead matter anywhere to be found. Everything is lively, vibrant, and creative. And devotion is one way to get into that, right? This kind of heart-centered approach. But again, yoga is good too. Nothing against yoga. Just one of those things. We just don't have time to talk about everybody's practices. It's not today. We'll get we'll have more time later. But for now, just barely scratching the surface to give you a sense of the great variety that's out there. So maybe we should move a little further east. Right? We've been talking about South Asian religions. Right? Buddhism, after all, started in India. I think it's very associated with Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism like Zen, but it started in India. So let's go then to ancient Chinese religions, Confucianism and Daoism. Do they have anything like a contemplative ecology to offer us? You know what my answer is going to be to that. It's yes, of course. Of course they do. Everybody does. This idea that religions are just about human-to-human interactions or human-to-divine interactions, that's true, but there's also human-earth relations. Every tradition has that. This doesn't mean any tradition has it perfect. Everybody's got their problems. And nobody's perfect, so we don't want to idealize or overly romanticize anybody. But one of the important things that you get from Confucianism and Taoism is a deep sense of the connection between humans, Earth, and the whole cosmos. So let's think of Taoism first. Taoism, very simple practice coming from Taoism, is the practice of Tai Chi. If you see people practicing Tai Chi in like a park or something, you see this very gentle, flowing movement. And that's good exercise. It's very good for your body. It's also good to calm your mind, bring a sense of peace, and it connects you with the energies of your environment. It connects you with the world around you, and ultimately, the earth around you is open to the sky, the heavens above, the cosmos. So this connection of human, earth, and cosmos is happening in Tai Chi. Easy to forget that when we think of it as just a personal practice, an individual practice, just something for mental health or for physical health. All that's true, but it also has this extra level, this ecological connectivity. So, for Taoists, another practice that they often advocate is doing nothing. Doing non-doing. Wei Wu Wei is how it's put in the classic Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching. Wei Wu Wei, doing non-doing. That makes it sound like laziness. It's not lazy. It actually means this kind of effortless and spontaneous movement in conjunction with the spontaneity of nature. In other words, going with the flow. Nature has a certain kind of movement, a certain kind of rhythm. It's pretty wild. Wild, not in the sense of the opposite of humans, not like the idea of wilderness as opposed to civilization, but wildness in the sense of spontaneous and creative. So for Taoists, they say if you want to engage in a deep contemplative connection with the earth, all you have to do, relax. You're already in that contemplative engagement with the earth. You just have to let it happen, let it wash over you. You don't need to know how to act. The universe will act through you if you can just be receptive and open to that. So those are a couple options, Tai Chi or nothing. And in both cases, right, we're bringing our attention away from consumer society, back to ourselves in an intimate relationship to our place on the planet. So, Confucianism and Daoism share a lot. They share the same understanding that the world is fundamentally a kind of energy, qi, and it's inflected in a kind of polarity of yin and yang, negative and positive, dark and light. But they have very different ways of handling that energy. Taoism, just wants you to kind of go with the flow, be spontaneous, do nothing. Confucianism wants you to kind of do stuff. Get educated, cultivate your personal potentials, and even engage with social issues. So could politics be a contemplative exercise? For Confucianism, it very much is. Politics is never mere policy making. It's always about connecting people to their place and to the cosmos. A harmonious society is the goal. And harmony doesn't just come from partisan bickering and debates. Harmony comes from people understanding their relationships to one another, their relationships to the earth, and ultimately their connection to the whole universe. Aligning human, earth, and cosmos is the work of politics for a Confucian. And of course, self-cultivation along the lines of education, also extremely important. This is one of the things where Confucianism would line up very well with science, that says if you really want to connect to the earth, let me tell you about education. Read some books about earth history, and you can connect to the earth. You can do it through education. So not only can contemplative exercises be like a political practice, it can also be scientific and educational or intellectual practices. So Confucianism and Daoism, they go together a bit. Like Confucianism playing the yang part, the very strong part that wants to do. Daoism, more like non-doing, very yin, a little more passive. But they fit together, right? Like hand in glove. So, again, we'll have to leave them behind because there's just too many people to talk about. And I'm already so, thankful for all these traditions for letting me speak about them. I have to say I'm speaking about them, but I don't speak for them. I'm not the spokesperson for these traditions. I am somebody who works with them very respectfully and loves them dearly, but I'm not a leader in any one of them. And so I want to make sure to hold that space and show my gratitude for the wisdom that I'm allowed to learn about and participate in ever so slightly. So maybe we should then turn back to Western religions, I guess they're called. It's weird because, Western religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they really come out of like Western Asia. So it's strange that we call them Western, right? But Western as opposed to Eastern, makes sense a little. Some people call them biblical religions because they have all that in common. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they have sacred scriptures, right? Whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament for Christians, or the Quran for Muslims. A lot of times when people talk about meditation and contemplation, they think Eastern religions first. But it turns out biblical religions have contemplative practices as well. In fact, the very word contemplation comes from the Latin contemplatio, right? It's a Western word. And so important to recognize that even in these Abrahamic faiths, the biblical faiths, that come out of Abraham, there's still practices for aligning your psyche in a very deep way with the earth. Kind of like nature mysticism. In Judaism, you have Kabbalah, you have Hasidism, that really tries to find God in your everyday life, not just inside of you, but in the world around you, in your encounters with plants and animals, in your farming practices, in the way you eat, right? In everything you do in your material existence, you can learn to tune into the presence of God in those spaces. Similarly, for Islam, you have Sufism. There's the famous Sufi poet, Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi. And Rumi makes this very clear, right, that our work is to kneel and kiss the ground, as Rumi puts it. There are many ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Let the beauty we love be what we do. That's mysticism, right? So contemplation, like meditation, it's a way of tuning in to a deeper level of yourself and deeper level of reality. And Sufism, Kabbalah, Hasidism, they have all these practices. And of course, Christianity has contemplative prayer, where the words that you're saying, or even wordless prayer, are a way to align yourself, not just with God, not just with the deeper parts of your soul, but with the entire created order. You can see this with some of the earliest contemplatives, the Desert Fathers. These are people who hung out in the desert in like the early centuries of Christianity, around 2,000 years ago. desert meditations. The clearness of the desert enabled them to clear their mind. And so when they opened up their mind, they were not just opening up their mind to God, they were opening up their mind to the desert. So again, it's not just about humans, it's not just about the divine, it's also about the earth. And it always has been. It's only been relatively recently, in the last few hundred years of modern society, industrialization, we've gradually forgotten about a variety of these practices. We've started to think that religion is mainly about humans, and that it doesn't necessarily have a connection to earth. And many people then critique religions for their anthropocentrism, right? Their human-centeredness, as if religions have a kind of human superiority complex. And maybe some of them do sometimes. But every single tradition has ways of thinking differently, where you're not centered on the human, as opposed to the earth. But you're seeing humans and earth in this kind of intimate reciprocity, in a mutually enhancing relationship. So you don't have to choose. Sometimes people think environmentalists are like anti-human, as if you have to choose between being anthropocentric or misanthropic. And that's not a good look for environmentalists. Nobody wants misanthropy, and yet anthropocentrism doesn't work either. Contemplative exercises indicate that there's an interconnectedness between humans and non-humans, so that you don't have to choose. It's not a choice between loving humans or hating humans. The real choice is between thinking of ourselves as disconnected, alienated from one another, alienated from the planet, or thinking of ourselves as deeply interconnected, so that our relationships deeply shape who we are. I often tell people that if you don't think relationships shape who you are, hold your breath, see how long that works out for you. I don't think it's going to work out very long. Try not drinking water. It's not going to work out that well. Actually, I wouldn't really advise trying those. Those are both dangerous things to do. You need water to live. You need oxygen to live. We're always in this metabolic exchange with the world around us. We're always exchanging energy, exchanging matter, right? We're always in this kind of flow. Breathing exercises are always an easy reminder of this. Constantly in the circulation of breath, inspiration, expiration, just the constant rhythm of our respiration, the constant beating of our hearts. These things are reminders that we are not alone. And that to be human at all is to be always already immersed deeply in ecological relationships. So, said a little about different religions. I should say, spirituality, when people talk about spiritual but not religious, that has plenty of practices too for doing this kind of work. And again, they might not always look like what you think contemplative work looks like. We often think about somebody just with eyes cast down, with a very rhythmic breathing, a spine straight, that kind of stuff. But for some spiritual practitioners, it depends. A good example, surfers. There's a sort of spirituality to some surfing communities. And that has often translated into activism. Once surfers feel deeply connected with the ocean and with the beach, they then want to protect it from pollution, from exploitation. The organization Surfrider is a good example. They're out there riding surf, but they aren't just doing it for the fun of it. There's a deep spiritual sense of belonging, and that leads them to care and to ethical and political action. So something like getting on a surfboard and folding yourself into the waves of the ocean, that too is a contemplative exercise. Not that different from what Taoists were talking about when they say go with the flow, right? When they want you to flow like the Tao, flow like the great way that things are. That's a similar thing for surfers. You learn to go with the flow. You learn to get a sense of how to follow the waves and let waves really guide you. So you can find these practices anywhere. Neo-pagan rituals and other kinds of new religious movements. There's plenty. There's no shortage. I should really add also, science is its own contemplative exercise. Helpful to know, as I mentioned, contemplation comes from Latin contemplatio. Contemplatio is a Latin translation of a Greek word. The Greek word is theoria, or theory, right? Theoria. And so, theory is what contemplation is all about. When we think of scientific theories these days, we don't necessarily think of them as contemplative. We often just think they're, this very limited band of our rational cognition. We don't think it's the full spectrum of psychic experience available to a contemplative. We think of rationality kind of cut off from the world of emotion, imagination, intuition, storytelling. But it turns out that in its most ancient sense, theory was a way of life. It wasn't just arguments and debates. Easy to forget if you just go to maybe the wrong philosophy class and the wrong program, and you're like, is philosophy and science just debates and arguments? But in the ancient sense, no, theory was a way of life. It was this contemplative exercise to change who you were, to have a kind of conversion experience so that you reorient your life to something higher, something more noble, your deeper self, your truest self. There's so many metaphors for it. And of course, if you look at all these ancient Greek schools of thought, Stoics and Platonists and cynics and skeptics, there's so many different ways that everybody was working with this idea of theory, but they did all share the sense that it's not just a matter of talking. It is a matter of changing your life and your community. And it was always about the natural world. It was never just about humans by themselves. It was always about the study of nature, trying to understand the nature of reality. So it's not lost to ancient history, though. The word might be, we don't use the word theory in that way anymore. But if you look at a lot of the great scientists of even the modern era or the 20th century, they'll tell you science does in fact involve emotional elements and imaginative elements. It has a storytelling component to it. If you read the works of Einstein, he's always talking about how important imagination is. If you read almost any scientist, it's not hard to tell that they're often overwhelmed with senses of awe and wonder at the beauty and complexity and majesty of the natural world. I mean, it's quite amazing, and it only gets more amazing. Around 100 years ago, one of the big debates among cosmologists was whether or not there were two galaxies. We knew that we had at least one galaxy. That's our galaxy, the Milky Way. And the question was, could there be another galaxy? And people were really scratching their heads about that. And like, I don't think the world is that big. And so people were like, it could be that big. And then, Edwin Hubble, the Hubble telescope, he was the one who looked out and saw and said, hey, I'm seeing some extra galaxies here. And people said, galaxies plural? There wasn't just one extra. There were more than two. And then as people increasingly developed more high-powered telescopes and did more research, we have learned that there are hundreds, even thousands, even millions, even billions of galaxies. Most recently, a few years ago, the latest count on galaxies was 2 trillion galaxies. The more we look into the universe, the more wild creativity we see in it. Turns out the universe that we're living in is about 14 billion years old and 2 trillion galaxies wide. How would that not cause you to wonder at the awesome creativity that we're immersed in? How are we part of that? Right? 14 billion years ago, there's an explosion that's basically hydrogen gas, and it turned itself into us. This is a big point from the evolutionary philosopher Brian Swimme. Thomas Berry worked with Brian Thomas Swimme on this book called The Universe Story. So very influential for my thinking, and also for Mary Lynn Tucker and John Grimm, who collaborated with Brian and were students of Thomas Berry. So we're all kind of thinking in the same ecosystem intellectually here. So how did it happen? How does hydrogen gas turn itself into you and me? Self-organization. That's been one of the big discoveries in 20th century science. Nothing is just a passive object. Everything is self-transforming and self-organizing. Autopoiesis is the kind of fancy scientific term, self-making. Right? Everything's making itself. Everything's organizing itself. right? When the hydrogen cloud is big enough, it starts collapsing under its own gravity. And then the hydrogen atoms start fusing with other hydrogen atoms. That's nuclear fusion. A star is born. How did the universe create stars? It organized itself into stars. And of course, stars create even heavier elements. And then when the star spends all its fuel, it goes into a supernova state and scatters those elements across the universe, and they turn into second generation stars that create even heavier elements. And then at some point, around 5 billion years ago, we get our star, the sun. And just the right relationship with Earth, and Earth turns alive. One of the other really important theories of the 20th century is that Earth isn't just a rock flying through space. It's more like a living thing than it is like a non-living thing. It's better to say that Earth is alive than to say it's a machine. Machines don't organize themselves. If I put gas in a car, the gas doesn't become the car in a way that when a person eats food, the food becomes your body, right? It's a different kind of system. Machines don't repair themselves in the way that I would repair myself if I get a cut. There are platelets, there's a scab. I repair myself, I'm self-organizing. It turns out the whole Earth is like this. It's not just that organisms self-organize. The whole Earth is doing it. The life, the land, the water, the atmosphere, they're all tied together. This is why people developed the idea of a Gaia hypothesis or Gaia theory, using the old term for the earth goddess in Greek mythology, Gaia, which is also the root of the word geology, the same Ga, right? So Gaia theory these days, people didn't like, scientists were maybe a little allergic to calling Earth Gaia because of the goddess implications, too mythological. So now people will just call this Earth system science in a lot of cases. But it's the same point, which is that Earth is a self-organizing whole, of which we're a part. Our mind is another sphere, along with the biosphere, the atmosphere, right? The life, the air, the land, the water, and our intelligence all come together to make one self-organizing whole. Of course, the danger right now is that humans are unraveling a lot of these dynamics. We see that by carbonating our atmosphere, that's having a lot of harmful impacts on the biosphere, on life. And that's changing our minds, adding more anxiety and fear and pain. And in turn, our societies then only polluting more. Even though the work that so many people are doing in climate justice or environmentalism, the work is going well in a lot of respects, but pollution is increasing. The use of fossil fuels still increasing. So Gaia theory lets us know that we're not acting like who we really are. We're acting like we live on a planet. That there's this big collection of objects called the planet, and we live on top of it, and we use the planet like a bunch of resources. We don't live on a planet. We are active participants in the planet's evolutionary unfolding. We're not apart from it, we're a part of it. I mean, you can really feel this anytime it rains. You're not on Earth, you're in it. There's a bunch of stuff above us. There's water above us, right? There's air above us. In a lot of cases, there's also mountain peaks above us. Unless you're the highest point on Earth, there's always a lot above you. What would it mean to feel ourselves not just as isolated humans on Earth? What if we felt ourselves as integral members of a living Earth community? So that you feel that your body is rooted deeply in Gaia. And so just studying biology, evolutionary cosmology, studying Earth systems is a way to transform your thinking, your feeling, and your acting to actually change your experience of yourself so that you stop feeling so isolated and you start to feel like you're part of this more complex whole. And again, what will guide you through that for scientists are things like imagination and wonder. It's not just the equations, right? It's the questions that keep driving us. Those questions are motivated by wonder. So there's no need for a kind of science versus religion dichotomy. sometimes, people want to talk about integrating science and religion. I'm like, that's nice, but it still makes them sound like separate things. And that if you look at ancient Greek scientists like, Pythagoras or Aristotle, what they were doing was spiritual. It was about contemplating the mind of God. It wasn't just about coming up with useful facts and figures that will help us innovate technology. Maybe they wanted some innovation, but there was also this more fundamental purpose of human life, that we have a purpose to connect with the intelligible order of the universe. And that's what science was doing. And it has never fully lost that sensibility. So even when you look at people like Hubble, or you look at Einstein, or you look at the cosmological work that Brian Swim has done, you get a sense of the wonder, the imagination, the awe, the emotional component, that we're telling a story about our intimate connection with the universe, not just coming up with facts and figures about a collection of objects. And likewise, religion is scientific. Religion is about knowledge in many respects. Somebody like Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic tradition emphasized so clearly that to be spiritual in relation to God means to exercise the full potential of your mind, and that includes your rational mind. So to be a good Catholic, learn science, in other words. And of course, the church maybe had some problems with Galileo. They haven't always fully owned up to that idea that we should honor scientists, integrate scientific facts, but they do pretty good generally. And there's enough of these saints and theologians that remind us that is the core point of the tradition. And again, remember this idea of traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous traditions. It's knowledge. The old Latin word for knowledge, scientia, science. Science just means knowledge. It's just an old Latinate word for knowledge. So when we say that indigenous traditions have ecological knowledge, we could also call that native science. Some scientists are like, well, we want to keep clear that there's different types of science or whatever it is. But still, the point is, it is not separating a world of spirituality or religion from a world of scientific inquiry. It's seen as fundamentally one path, that our spirituality is tied up with the way we know the world, and that knowledge is never just about knowing things for instrumental reasons, to get stuff done, to use stuff. Knowledge is always about connecting us to our higher purpose, to a deeper sense of participation in the beauty and complexity of the world around us. So we can maybe relax on the categories of science versus religion. Some traditions don't have those at all. Indigenous traditions don't know why you would come up with these different categories and try to compartmentalize your life. And also in Hinduism, there's no separation between the philosophical work they do, the scientific work they do, logic, mathematics, versus the spiritual side, the meditative side. These are all seen as integrated. So we can think back into that integrated sense of self. We don't have to fall into the compartmentalizations that our modern world is so clinging to. So that's a kind of rough and dirty tour of the whole world. We're looking a little bit at all the world's religions, indigenous traditions, Eastern religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Daoism. We're looking at Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're looking at scientific traditions, right? And they're all kind of saying the same thing. Humans, we're not alone here. We're deeply interconnected. And the more that you fall into any one of these ways of knowing, the more that interconnectedness becomes real to you. The more it stops being just an idea or a belief and becomes an experience. Right? Because you can believe that you're intimately connected to the ocean because you understand that oceans produce a lot of oxygen, we need oxygen. Sure, you can understand that cognitively, but can you feel it? Can you experience it? Ultimately, that's what all these contemplative practices help with, is taking these ideas out of the abstract, taking them out of just the realm of belief, and moving it into our bodies, into our experiences, into our day-to-day interactions. So that even if you are walking down a path and you see a little crawfish that's somehow flipped on its back, that you'll care about it. You won't just pass it by and ignore it and not think it matters, things start to show up to you. Things start to matter. And again, that feels good. You're doing compassionate work, maybe for this little crawfish, maybe flip it back over so it's not caught on its back anymore, with its claws just kind of pinching up in the air. You flip it over, you care for it. That little gesture of care isn't done because somebody was yelling at you to be a better person. It was done because you felt connected. That's love, that's devotion, right? That's the kind of service that bhakti is all about in Hinduism. You're doing it out of love, you're doing it out of celebration. Not doing it because somebody told you to. It's such a different kind of environmentalism, such a different way of thinking about it, where it's not all these kind of prescriptions coming from activists telling you what to do. There's an inner sense of purpose that's guiding you. And it's not prohibitions telling you what not to do. It's compassion telling you what to do. It's devotion telling you what to do. It's wonder that's guiding you. It's celebration that's guiding you. So, to return to what I initially opened with was this idea that there's so many perspectives on Earth. And right now, our great challenge is coordinating them, is integrating them. We have global ecological problems. We need globally coordinated solutions. We need planet-scale collective action, and we need it now. I mean, really, we need it yesterday. We need it decades ago. It'd be great if we had done a lot of this work like the early 90s, then it wouldn't be quite so urgent now, but unfortunately it is very urgent now. This urgent integration challenge, so that humans stop thinking of themselves as the resource users on Earth and start thinking of themselves as plain members and citizens of the Earth community, a kind of Earth diplomacy, right, where not only multiple cultures can interact, share their wisdom with one another, and work together toward a better future. But those multiple cultures can also work with the animals, the plants, the bacteria, the fungi, the ecosystems, the mountains, and the rivers. It's not just humans doing this alone. It's about us integrating with one another and integrating with the whole Earth community to become a planet. I mean, we've known that we're on a planet scientifically for like 500 years. People like Copernicus and Galileo were really responsible for saying, hey, we're on a planet, we're on one of these things that flies around in the sky. We thought previously that, for the most part, we thought that we were on a stable place and everything revolved around us, right? This kind of geocentric model of the universe. Turns out, no. We're spinning. We're moving. We've known we're on a planet for centuries. It's time to start acting like it. It's time to start acting like Gaia's citizens. It's time to start acting like a radical Earth democracy. And who knows what this means politically? It's going to be different for different cultures, right? Every place, every culture is going to have its own way of negotiating this integration. But it's urgent that everybody does that work. Come together, integrate multiple perspectives, and figure out a way for us to join in the greater whole. To find the ocean that has many shores looking out onto it. To find the elephant, right, in the room, beyond all of our perspectives. So, one of the ways that Thomas Berry puts this when he's talking about the great work, right, to carry out this transition away from our destructive presence on the planet toward mutually enhancing human-Earth relations. He says, basically, we have to reinvent the human. Which sounds like a big task. It kind of is. Humans aren't lords of creation. We're not the top of the great chain of being, as if animals and plants, and bacteria and fungi and stones and rivers are all less than us. It's a different world. What if we think of ourselves as deeply interconnected with all beings, woven in a web with them, inseparable from them? So we need a new sense of what it means to be human, right? A human not at the center of the universe, but a human that's deeply interrelated, intimately, with all beings. So how do you do that? How do you reinvent the human? Give some simple steps. First of all, critical reflection. We can't just do this willy-nilly. Can't be compulsive. Sometimes this kind of zeal for transformation can be dangerous if you're doing it uncritically. So we need critical reflection. That means philosophy, ethics. We need definitely scientific facts. All this talk about how science is more than just facts, sure, but we still need those facts. We need the data. We need good computer models to tell us how weather and climate interact, right? We need all that critical reflection. And then we need to use that in a way that puts us back into our ecological context. We need to start feeling our connections to life, land, air, and water. We need to start feeling that those things are separate from us, right? That they are us, and that we intimately impact them. So, reinvent the human with critical reflection and reintegrate us into our ecological context. But also include us in our evolutionary context. We need a sense of deep time, a sense that we're part of a 14 billion year journey, and that we have a vast future ahead of us. What would it mean to plan not just for the next 10 years, but for the next 10,000 years? Imagine if we had a plan to make the world better, not just for the next generation, but as some indigenous communities say, for the next 7 generations. We can at least do 7 generations, right? A sense of our evolutionary heritage, our 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, 4.5 billion years of Earth evolution, that large time scale helps open us up to the possibility of deeper future planning. So, simple, right? Reinvent the human. We'll use critical reflection to reconnect us with our ecological and evolutionary contexts. But there's still that question, by what means are we going to do this? And Barry's answer is very simple, deceptively so. Some of the most complicated answers are very simple, like somebody saying, love your neighbor, or something like that. Very easy to say, not so easy to live. It takes a lifetime to do it. So how are we doing? By means of what? It's by means of 2 things, story and shared dream experience. So story, that's one of the things we've been talking about with all these traditions. Religions are about story. Myth, right? The old Greek word mythos. Myth just means story or divine story. Doesn't mean false. That's still, kind of the common usage when people are myth busting and all that kind of stuff. Myth means fake. Of course, it just means story. And story motivates people because it helps us understand ourselves. There's plenty of data showing data doesn't change people's hearts and minds. There are a lot of facts and studies that say facts and studies alone do not change people's hearts and minds. Stories do. Because it's the story that tells us how we fit into it. Because you can tell me facts, but if I don't know what that means for my life, for my experience, for where I've been, where I'm at, where I'm going, then how is it going to change me? I might think it's interesting. I might say, wow, somebody's got to do something about that. But I'm not going to embody any kind of consistently changed perspective from that. If you really want to change my perspective, turn me around to a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a new way of being, we're going to need narratives to do it. And those can come from religions. They can also come from other places. There are plenty of nature writers that just draw on their own personal experiences, their embodied experiences, their memories. Plenty, right? You don't necessarily need a religion. You could look at the arts. That's another amazing source of narratives, stories, different ways of imagining, right? So sciences also can tell their own stories. You have that with some of the best scientists. They don't just write their material in a way that other scientists understand it. Sometimes they put it into a narrative for regular people to understand, to make it make sense. So plenty of ways to tell a story. Just gather around a fire with some friends, tell some stories. So endless ways to do it. As Rumi said, right, there are endless ways to kneel and kiss the ground. But it's not just story. Story alone isn't sufficient. Barry didn't lead with story. He says by means of story and shared dream experience. That needs some unpacking. What is a shared dream experience? I mean, to some extent, you could think of this in terms of Martin Luther King's dream, right? His famous "I Have a Dream" speech. That just like King had a dream for a more just future, that we can have a dream for a better future. And it wouldn't just be a dream of racial equality. That's probably there as well. But also a dream of our ecological interconnectedness. And King himself was already moving toward some ecological thinking toward the end of his terribly shortened life. One line from King says that we live in an inescapable network of mutuality. Can't sound much more ecological than that. We live in an inescapable network of mutuality, and injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So the fight for justice anywhere is ultimately a fight for global justice. And when you understand that inescapable network of mutuality enough, you understand that that's not just a network of mutuality between humans. It's also between the material conditions that support our life. It's the earth. So that's kind of what you could think that Barry is saying. A shared dream experience is like a shared political vision. But he means more than that. He means something like a shared contemplative experience. Something that's sufficiently entrancing to make us feel the deepest parts of our being. You can hear a story, but if a story doesn't also have this shared contemplative experience with it, it won't necessarily touch you that deeply. It might sound like an important issue of our times, but these things are more than issues, right? It's more than just an issue that needs to be dealt with in order for us to have a more sustainable presence on the planet. Not just issues, it's our purpose. It's what we're here for. And you can feel that in a contemplative experience. You get in touch with your deeper purpose, right? That life isn't purposeless or meaningless. It's not that we just kind of make up purposes for ourselves. There's something deep in us that connects us to one another. It's part of the earth's whole purpose for being. And that can help drive the action. This kind of dream, right? The dream drives the action. There's so many ways of contemplating earth. These are all ways of experiencing the dream of the earth. And it's not just a dream we're having about the earth. We're tuning into the fact that the earth itself is dreaming. That the earth already is producing images, just like dreams do. Except these images aren't just in our heads. These images are the shapes, the forms of the life, land, air, and water of earth. Evolution, creating a great diversity of species, that's the dream of the earth. So when we're dreaming about the earth, we're dreaming about an earth that itself dreams. When we are contemplating earth, we're dreaming about an earth that itself is living, contemplating, imagining, dreaming of us. So dream images coming from the creative power of the human mind, right, align with a dream of the living earth community. This would be a dream of the living earth community, by the living earth community, and for the living earth community. So, we can ask ourselves, as we did when I opened, what do we think about when we think about earth? What do we contemplate when we contemplate earth? Imagine it from outside, imagine it from inside, imagine it at the very biggest scale, the very smallest scale. Think about it from every cultural lens from around the world. And still we're left with this kind of mystery.
Sorry.
What are we thinking about? What are we imagining? What are we tuning into? So let that question kind of be an enduring quest. And it's this kind of, like Zen Buddhists have a koan, a question for which there's no rational answer, but a question that's supposed to guide you into a deeper meditative awareness. So we can continually ask ourselves, what do we contemplate when we're contemplating earth? Maybe, in its deepest, when we are contemplating earth, we are the earth contemplating itself. After all, we are the same matter and energy that exploded 14 billion years ago in this great flaring forth of energy. It took a little while, but it eventually turned itself into us, into our bodies, our minds, and our thinking. So we're not just thinking about the earth, we're the earth thinking about itself. And this means that when we're protecting the earth, we're not just protecting a bunch of natural resources that we need in order to secure our own material future. we're not just protecting resources out there. We are the earth protecting itself, caring for itself, loving itself. So, I'll leave it with that question. What do we contemplate when we are contemplating Earth? Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to chatting with you for a little bit here. We have maybe 15, 20 minutes or something that we'll be able to ask some questions. So I'm looking forward to engaging with that. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for that broad, sweeping tour of history of life and the various contemplative traditions. I feel inspired and nourished and prompted to consider new perspectives. To speak to the questions, I will begin with a question that ties in with where you left us with your invitation. And if we are the earth contemplating itself, how do you describe the deterioration in the human bodies that is in parallel with the deterioration in the body of the earth? And is this one shared dream that is in metamorphosis, or how would you address the the theme of personal health in unison with planetary health?
That's great. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, the more research that comes out, both in terms of physical health and mental health, shows that as Earth systems are declining in their health, our physical and mental health is going right with it. We can think of the wildfires, right, that have hit so much of the west coast of North America this season, right? Those fires impact people's physical health quite obviously, right? You're just inhaling smoke that's not good for you. But also the levels of anxiety and stress and the way that's going to infect our interpersonal relationships, right? If I'm very anxious, then when I come home and I talk to my wife, maybe I'll be less kind to her. And so I'm just spreading this kind of negativity around. As some therapists like to say, hurt people, right? People who have been hurt have a tendency to then go on and hurt more people. And so then as we're feeling more hurt, we don't feel empowered then to go care for the earth. So it's this vicious cycle that if we're hurt, we're not going to care for the earth. And as the earth is damaged, it'll damage us further, so we'll have even less energy for caring for the earth. And so at this point, it sounds a lot less like a dream of the earth and more like a nightmare of the earth. And King's I Have a Dream speech goes there as well. He does say, basically, that he's aware of the nightmare of racism, but he will not wallow in a valley of despair. And so I would recommend the same. We have to be aware of this nightmare. It's serious, it's urgent, it's at a planetary scale. These aren't local environmental problems. We're talking about global climate change. We're talking about mass extinction of species. So one way to think about it might be a very simple metaphor. These pangs are birth pangs. And that right now, Earth is going through something like a birth process. That Gaia is first emerging as Gaia to humans who are aware of that. We've never, as a whole species, been connected with one another and the earth like we currently are. It's taken, a few 100,000 years for humans to wrap themselves all the way around the planet and get to know one another and to connect with the planet itself in a really deep way through mining, industrialization, things like that. So right now we're kind of in this really difficult, destructive phase of our evolution. And it looks like we're killing ourselves and killing the earth in the process. Sometimes birth processes are like that, and they do feel like near-death experiences to some extent. So if it feels like we're going through a near-death experience, know that we're at a fork in the road where that can turn into more destruction, violence, and extinction. Or it can turn into a birth of a truly planetary civilization, of a real Earth democracy.
In the traditions that you've studied, and I know you acknowledged it was not possible to name all that exist. Are there any that foreshadowed or prophesized this rebirth?
Yeah, in a way, I think you can find that in a lot of these traditions, which is part of why it's so important to respect the wisdom of our religious traditions and indigenous cultures, because if they knew this was coming, they had a sense that maybe there's something inherent about humans that can kind of go awry, and it's easy for us to forget who we are, to maybe let our egos and our greed, our selfishness take a little bit too much control, and then all of a sudden everything goes terribly. I mean, you can think about this, and the Bible is an easy example. Think about the story of Noah. Things got so bad that Noah had to wipe out all humanity, and he saved like one family, Noah and his wife, and then all the animals in the world, two of each kind, so they could reproduce. So there's already this sense that humans might go so off base in our character that we might need to completely reset the whole thing. The book of Revelations would be another one. The book of Genesis tells the story of Noah, the first book of the Bible. The last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, is Apocalypse. And if you read that, it's very clear that a lot of environmental destruction is tied up with a lot of human injustice. They go hand in hand throughout that book, but it doesn't end with the nightmare of injustice and environmental destruction. It ends with God saying, I'm going to make everything new. Remember, apocalypse doesn't mean it's the end. Apocalypsis means revelation. So what is being revealed through all this destruction and injustice? It's up to us. We can put our finger on the scale. We can turn the wheel, and we can make sure that what's being revealed and what's being made new is a world of peace, justice, and a sustainable and regenerative relationship to our land.
Thank you for speaking to those sources and how they can provide guidance in this important time. In the spirit of this same theme, we have a question. Excuse me a minute as I pull that specific question up, that asks about the time in history when you spoke to the indigenous cultures that you just a moment ago distinguished that today is the first time that the whole world is in touch with one another. But there's a question that asks, what ended the prevalence of the indigenous cultures that you spoke about at the beginning of your talk and made that become a much more minimal presence in how humanity progressed, or if you want to call it progress, unfolded?
That's a great point, right? I guess we could say that the thing that came in the way was this idea of progress, and this idea that humans should build themselves up and get very big. And you can trace this back to the Neolithic Revolution. So we're talking, like 10,000 years ago. You had the invention of writing, for instance. And you know how weird it is to read a book silently to yourself? It seems blatantly antisocial. Staring at little squiggles on a page and kind of saying something silently in your mind. Whereas oral cultures, if you want to communicate, you actually do it in the presence of another person. You feel my words resonating in your ears. There's an intimacy to that. So yeah, following the Neolithic Revolution, you gradually had this thing called progress or civilization. Should always put that in quotes. And that was displacing a couple 100,000 years of human evolution, right? The Paleolithic era, when humans were not scaling up their civilization very big, but there were some societies. It's important to know that Paleolithic humans were by no means primitives, and these were intelligent people with vibrant cultures. And the more archaeological evidence we have, the more we see that they actually have some pretty complex societies, and yet seen as primitive or savage and all these kinds of things. So again, it's been a very protracted problem for thousands of years, and you can see certain moments, in particular, the colonial era in the modern period, the last 500 years, have been absolutely devastating. So if there was a tendency to suppress indigenous wisdom in favor of written culture, the colonial project was full-blown genocide. So terrible, terrible tale. And such a key part of this work is to work on decolonization, which means revitalizing indigenous languages that have been lost or nearly lost. And it means restoring relationships to land. Sometimes people talk about decolonization, that's just about words or land acknowledgements. But we're talking about actually changing material conditions to the land and restoring indigenous sovereignty so that indigenous communities can do their cultural practices. So that's extremely vital. These traditions carried humanity for so long and have been so deeply suppressed. So no matter what traditions or what practices you're working with, integrating some concern for indigenous traditions, I think, is crucial.
Thank you for that very complete answer. And one part that I'll just elevate is your point that it was a significant inflection to move from oral communication to written. And that certainly prompts some reflection for me right now in terms of how our current ways of conducting work and among many people, their way of conducting their personal communication is through texting and email, and how that takes it even further than just writing on parchment. And so I just center that insight to invite us all to consider how to bring more oral communication into our lives as a relational skill, as that's something you just highlighted. So thank you for that. To another question, we have an individual who says, how can contemplative practice help us to be in the world effectively, even in the face of contrary experiences? Sometimes there seems to be a discord in what works for the mind spiritually and behaviors that are required to survive in the worldly sense.
Very good question. I think one of the things that seems very crucial about contemplative practice is that it builds emotional resilience. And we're all going to need a lot of that, especially even after this last year and a half approximately of dealing with a global pandemic. A lot of people are feeling pretty drained. And as our emotional resilience wears down, we start becoming a little more reactive. And you have all kinds of avoidance behaviors or maybe even violent behaviors that come out. And if you do contemplative practice, it's pretty clear, the studies are overwhelmingly clear, that you actually build a lot more emotional resilience so that things don't rattle you as much. And we even see this in the brains of people who do mindfulness-based stress reduction, that it actually reduces the gray matter in the brain that gets shocked by emotions. And it lets the decision-making part of your brain have a little bit more room for non-judgmental activity. So it's this kind of paradox. By getting in touch with our emotions more, then we're not rattled by them as much, and we're more resilient. So we can withstand those kind of shocks. Because that's the world, right? Our worldly business is constantly shocking us. It's a very shocking and complicated world, and increasingly so. So contemplative practice helps us basically stay cool. As the Buddhists have it, the desire is this flame that kind of ignites us and makes us do crazy things. So to cool off.
Brings to mind the element theory of how you mentioned yin and yang, and how the balancing of the elements and how one converts and calms or supports another.
Yeah.
Would you like to say anything about the element theory?
Yeah, because it is the crucial thing for Taoism and Confucianism is this kind of harmony, and contemplation helps you work with that. And specifically, and you can always find this in other traditions as well, like there's some yoga meditations that also work with the elements, and it's this kind of thing where you sense the connection between the inner and the outer. For instance, the fire of my desires versus the fire in the actual world, the fire of global warming, perhaps, or the wind of my breath breathing in and out versus the wind of the world around me. And so you're harmonizing yourself with the world while you're also harmonizing these different energies in you. And you're learning to balance it out, which doesn't mean that you ever find any equilibrium, but it means that wherever you're at, you can find where your next step is going to be. So you can warm up a little when you need to, you can cool off a little when you need to. In Tai Chi, you can see this very explicitly, because people will do a movement that's kind of sharp, and then it'll get really soft. It'll be kind of forceful and rigid, and then it'll get very supple and fluid. And so they're constantly moving from one to the other. So you don't have to worry about finding a stable, fixed point in the storm. It's okay to be, kind of affected by these things, and you just know how to move along the path. I kind of think of the old saying, right, that storms can't hurt the sky. So it's okay that there's all this tumultuous energy. You just learn how to move with it.
Thank you. Are you aware of any global coordination pursuits comparable to the COP26 convening that is about to happen that would include Tai Chi practices and discussions that acknowledge the energies of those speaking and the contemplative components that could contribute to the, as you phrased it, the reinvention of the human?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's organizations at a lot of levels, local, regional, national, international. And I might just direct people to the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology website, which has a tremendous amount of resources for learning where these organizations are and what they do. But there's a lot of them, faith-based organizations, as they call them, FBOs. And a lot of them are working toward the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So they're hearing what's happening at conferences like COP26, and they're working on it from their more spiritual perspective. And then they're trying to let that spirituality then influence these climate change conferences as well. And even recently, you have like the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church all saying that the environmental crisis is a spiritual crisis. They were saying this just, a couple weeks ago ahead of the COP26 conference. So they're out there. The Catholic Church would be an example of an organization that's international in scope. It has 1 billion adherents. And they're explicitly saying through Pope Francis that this is, in fact, a spiritual crisis. And it is about the energy of God and not just the energy of fossil fuels. And so, a variety of other organizations are doing that kind of work. And sometimes it's global. Sometimes when the local organizations are happening, they have a lot of power too. And I should add, a lot of them are also emphasizing justice more than ever. They see that it's not just an environmental crisis and a spiritual crisis, it's also a social justice crisis. So people are seeing these connections more clearly than ever.
And would you state again the website at Yale?
Yeah, happy to. The Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And so a really big website and a hub for a lot of research and advocacy around these issues. And so you can look up faith-based organizations and sustainable development goals, and you'll find a whole list of organizations there, and pages on eco-justice and that kind of work. So it's inspiring to see all this work being done, and you'll find ways to get connected to organizations in your area or to more international
organizations. Thank you for that very constructive resource. We have another question. The individual begins by saying, I appreciate the broad view of Gaia. How do you envision this in dialogue with entrenched big business and international political interests that so powerfully shape our dialogue in the world today?
Yeah, that's a great question. When the environmental movement got started in America, like in the 1960s, proper environmentalism, it was generally like anti-business. You could trace some of this back to people like John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, that were really kind of anti-social. They liked being in nature, didn't trust society. And more recently, people have realized that this is the future of business. And so an important way to address this when talking to economic interests or political interests, this is just about job creation at this point. One of the best ways to facilitate more job creation right now is to move toward renewable energies. That coal-fired electric plants aren't producing jobs. But construction of solar panels, the installation of solar panels, innovating more efficient solar technologies, it's just jobs, jobs, jobs. And so it's actually good for business. And of course, people who are deeply entrenched in money from the fossil fuel industries are still really resistant to that. But their profits are falling rapidly. And the writing is on the wall. The money in the future is going to be made in sustainability and more generative relationships to the land. And then, of course, political instability is always exacerbated by environmental problems. So if you want to have a stable nation with a lot of jobs, the environment, right? Switch to renewables, become more regenerative, more intimate connections with the land. So it's not as opposing as it seems. And I should also add, it's not as politically polarizing as it seems. If you interview young Republicans and young Democrats, they all care about climate change overwhelmingly. So some of these old entrenched oppositions are gradually leaving their positions of power, and the new generation that's coming up has a very different attitude and has a sense of urgency. And we can do it as conservatives, we can do it as liberals, but everybody wants to make these steps.
With that very promising message, we'll offer you a very challenging question, which is that even with the positive economic prospects through the green economy, is the core question and the core issue one of lifestyle and economics that support lifestyles as they've become, as much of the world has become accustomed to or aspires to? Is that what needs to change, and that the level of consumption needs to change?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, people are often worried about austerity, right? Are we going to have to give up stuff? And basically the answer is no. I mean, there's some people, if you're the ultra rich and you're always on a private jet, okay, you might need to fly commercial, right? Okay. But even then, if we develop more renewable energies and things like that, you might still be on your private jet a little bit. One of the big things that needs to change is the waste in the material throughput in the economy, to kind of put it technically. But there's just a ton of waste. In the United States, like every other bite of food is waste. We lose a lot in really sloppy processes of production, sloppy processes of transportation. If you relocalize a lot of production, a lot of that waste gets eliminated. So we can still eat as much food as we have. You say, well, can I still have a computer? Yeah, but we shouldn't design them to break every 2 years. That's a terrible design. It's called planned obsolescence, right? This plan to make things obsolete. That's why you always have to buy a new computer every couple of years or new shoes every couple of years. And the fashion industry is also like, yeah, keep buying new stuff every year and a half. So if we eliminate some of our waste problem and some of our obsolescence in our technology, we can still have...
Gotta go. Thanks for listening.
We can still have computers. We can still have the internet. It just won't be helping grow the GDP, right? Our gross domestic product might shrink because it turns out it's good for the stock market to